It doesn't talk about Jesus. It doesn't talk about salvation. It doesn't talk about God. It doesn't talk about mercy or grace. It's kind of like a chick flick in book form. It's this love story of a Gentile woman named Ruth, and she falls in love with a Jewish man named Boaz. They get married and have a son. Okay, I'm done. But what it does give us is part of the lineage. And it turns out that she's the great-great-grandmother of King David. And so all it does is in the end, in the last chapter or two, the last verse or two, it shows us the lineage from Boaz down to David. And so it looks like on the surface that's all it gives us. But when we look at this book a lot closer and we start looking at like hidden meanings, it's incredible what this book has in it. Ruth, Esther, and Philemon are kind of three books in the Bible that have nothing to do with the Bible, but yet they have the most profound meanings when we really start looking deep into them. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to go through all 4 chapters, and I'm going to kind of give an overview of the book of Ruth. And then next week we'll go really deep into the first 2 chapters, and then really deep in the last 2 chapters on the last time. So it's kind of one of those things you have to like wait for the end. So yeah, this is kind of one of those wait for the end things. And I'll have to go really fast since Dwayne told me I could only do it in 4 hours. So to get you out of here before midnight, I'm going to have to go through this pretty quick. So what I'll do, I've got all of the verses here on the screen. It's in NIV for the most part. And we'll read through them, and then I'll go through and kind of explain each one as we go. So with that, let me start with prayer. That always helps. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this evening, for everyone gathered here, for us to be able to gather in your house and worship and learn your word, especially in these times that are kind of so crazy. But God, I just ask you to fill this place with your Holy Spirit and help us with our understanding. And Father, just ask you to help and guide me with the words I say and how I go through this, so that's interesting and informative and correct. And I pray this in the name of your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Okay. So first of all, it starts out, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man from Bethlehem in Judea, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, his wife's name was Naomi, and the name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephraimites from Bethlehem, Judea, and they went to Moab to live there. Okay, so it kind of starts out telling us what happened in the start of this chick flick. So Ruth takes place near the ends of the time of Judges. Remember, the Israelites had come out of Egypt. They had gotten to the Promised Land. Joshua had taken them over into the Promised Land, and they had 400 years under Judges. And that was before they decided they wanted a king, and the book of Samuel started. So it fits right between Judges and Samuel. So it's a period of 400 years of history following the Israelites out of the Promised Land. During this time, God would raise up judges from time to time to deliver people from challenges. Some of these were Gideon, Samson, and Deborah. They kind of lived without a leader. God was to be their leader at these times. And they would have a high priest mediator between them. They didn't have a king. They didn't have leaders or rulers. But God would raise up a judge for a short period of time, typically as a military leader, to help them through a campaign if they were having problems with surrounding nations. At the end of Judges, it was kind of a dark time in history. People had started falling away from God pretty quickly once they got the Promised Land. And it was summed up in Judges 21:25. In those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Kind of reminds us of what's going on today, doesn't it? Okay, so the story starts with a man named Elimelech and his wife Naomi, and their 2 sons leaving Bethlehem due to the drought and moving to Moab. What's kind of ironic about that is Bethlehem means house of bread. Like Bethel means house of God, Bethlehem means house of bread. So they're leaving the house of bread because of a famine. But they traveled to Moab. Now, Moab and the Moabites were descendants of Lot. When the angels had rescued Lot from Sodom, when Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, Lot fled with his 2 daughters. Lot's 2 daughters, thinking they were the only humans left on earth, got Lot drunk and slept with him and had conceived one son each, had two sons. The sons of Lot and his two daughters were Moab and Ammon. So the land of Moab was named for one of his sons, and that was the land of Moab and the Moabites. And the other son, Ammon, was the Ammonites. So these were the two nations that grew up from Lot, or descended from Lot. So God had promised the Israelites would be well cared for if they remained faithful to him. But we see here that if there was a famine in the land, that they may not have been very faithful to him at the time. Amalek was making a great mistake leaving Bethlehem. His name means God is king. So even though he didn't live a life that supported his name, with the famine in Bethlehem, Amalek's plans were probably to go to Moab for a short period of time, get through the famine, and return. Ends up there 10 years. So he's there 10 years before his wife returned. His two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, I guess. Mahlon means sick, and Chilion means pining or wasting away. What great names to name your children, huh? So, pining and wasting away, they headed off to Moab. So, when they got there, the two sons ended up taking wives from Moab women, and that would have definitely been against the will of God. So they end up in the land of Moab. They're there 10 years. The two sons end up marrying two Moabite women. During the Exodus, the Israelites had passed through the land of Moab. And when they did, the Moabites refused to give them food and also persuaded many of them to worship their gods. And that's the little g God. Ruth 1:3-6. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with two sons. They married Moabite women, one named Ophrah and one named Ruth. After they lived about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left with her without her two sons or her husband. When she heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people and provided food for them, Moab and her daughter-in-laws prepared to return home. Okay, so now if we look here now, Naomi is in Moab with all the Moabites and their little g gods. She's got her two sons have died, her husband has died, and now she's got two Moabite daughter-in-laws. So the three widow ladies without sons would have left them as one of the lowest disadvantaged classes in the ancient world. It would have been very tough for them to even survive in this situation. So this would have had great influence to Naomi to return to Bethlehem. Ruth tries to persuade her daughters to stay in Moab when she feels that they would do better and possibly remarry. So she kind of wants to go home by herself, but her two daughter-in-laws at first want to go with her. We see let me go next slide here. Okay, with her two daughter-in-laws, she left the place where she had been living and set out on the road that would take them back to the land of Judah. Then Naomi said to her two daughter-in-laws, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord show kindness to you, as you have shown to the dead and to me. May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud and said to her, "We will go back with you to your people." So it's an emotional parting that shows it had a deep relationship. So obviously, Naomi and her two daughter-in-laws were very close. It was customary, if a husband dies, for a brother to take the woman to be his wife and have children to continue the brother's line. Yet Naomi, without any sons or husband to have sons, nor a husband to have sons, knew there was no way then for them to continue the family line. Naomi feels the Lord's hand is against her. She feels that the bad things happening were a result of being disobedient to God by leaving Bethlehem. Yet instead of fleeing from God, she decides to return. She could easily have become bitter, yet she knows she would grow closer to God in her hardship. Naomi said to her daughters, let me just continue this. So after this one, we'll go back with you to your people. But Naomi said, "Return home, my daughters. Why would you be with me? Am I going to have more sons? Who could become your husbands? Return home, my daughters. I am too old to have another husband. Even if there was still hope for me, even if I had a husband and I gave birth to sons, why would you wait until they grew up? Would you remain unmarried for them? No, my daughter, it is more bitter for me than you, because the Lord's hand has gone out against me." At this they wept aloud. Then Oprah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, and Ruth clung to her. Look, said Naomi, your sister-in-law is going back to her people and her gods. Go back with her. But Ruth replied, do not argue with me. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go, and where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if anything but death separates you and me. When Naomi realized that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped urging her. Okay, Oprah, even though she loves Naomi, decided to stay in Moab. Well, Ruth decides to go back with Naomi. The wording here in verse 14 is Ruth clung to Naomi. The word is a Hebrew word, dabak, which means to cling to stay with, pursue closely, adhere as with glue. So she really wanted to stay with her mother-in-law. When Naomi tries to decide Ruth from going with her, Ruth gives an eloquent statement of faith, dedicating her life to helping her mother-in-law. But most important, Ruth says, your God will be my God. With this, she leaves behind the gods of her people to travel to Judea and serve the living God. It isn't mentioned in the text, but Naomi must have had a great influence on the people around her. Even in times of trouble, or perhaps more so in times of trouble, Naomi showed great trust in God, and with her example, Ruth was persuaded to turn to God. So the two women went until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, can this be Naomi? Don't call me Naomi, she told them. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune on me. So when they reach Bethlehem, the small village, the people come out to meet them. They recognize Naomi, yet they seem to question if it's her. The 10 years must have been hard on her. She responds by asking them to call her Mara. Naomi's name means pleasant, yet after what she had been through, she feels Mara, which means bitter, is a more fitting name. When the Israelites had left Egypt, they came to a place of bitter water. And the place of that is called Mara. We find that in Exodus 15:22. Naomi had returned empty, but that was the reason they left Bethlehem in the first place. Naomi and her husband had left to go to Moab, thinking their life in Bethlehem was empty, but now Naomi returns with her husband and sons, and is now more empty than when she left. All she has now is a daughter-in-law. Elimelech had sold their land before they had left, so Naomi returned to nothing, but she has returned to God. So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem as a barley harvest was just beginning. It was a season of barley. This is a spring harvest at the time of Passover. 50 days later, the wheat would be ready to harvest at Pentecost. Now, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side from the clan of Elimelech, a man of standing whose name was Boaz. Here we see that Boaz's name was standing in strength. He was related to Naomi's deceased husband, Elimelech. We know from the lineage in Matthew that Boaz's parents were Salmon and Rahab. Rahab was the woman who had hid the two spies in her house at Jericho in exchange for the Israelites not killing her or her family when the Israelites crossed over in the Promised Land and captured Judea. You remember how there was the two spies that she hid? I often wonder if one of them was Salmon. Because later, after he rescued her, that she ended up married to Salmon. Okay, notice that Boaz was a wealthy man. Naomi and her husband had left Bethlehem 10 years early due to famine, yet when Naomi returned, the people who stayed were still there, alive and well. He's shown as being a kinsman in ancient Hebrew is Goel. So Goel was typically a special family representative. So Ruth and the Moabitess said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone else in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." So when she went out and started gleaning in the fields behind the harvesters, as it turns out, she found herself working in a field belonging to Boaz, who was from the clan of Elimelech. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted his harvesters. "The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you," they called back. So Ruth decides to go out and glean in the fields. Obviously, she had learned a lot about the Hebrew from her mother-in-law, Naomi. It was the law for owners of land who harvest crops to leave whatever they missed on the first pass and whatever is in the corner of the fields for the less fortunate people to gather. It's sort of kind of like a modern-day welfare program, and it's found in Leviticus 19:9 through 10. So Boaz, even though it was drought conditions, still adhered to the old laws and leaves the leftover for the poor. But also notice that the poor still have to work to get the leftovers. So it's kind of like providing a way to survive, but they still have to do it with dignity. Ruth, by volunteering to go to the fields and gather for herself and Naomi, shows a hardworking spirit. This is probably a lot more spiritual than sitting home and just praying for food. So it may seem like a coincidence that Ruth just happened to find Boaz's field to glean. Of course, nothing is a coincidence in God's eyes, right? Yeah, so this was Boaz. The way Boaz addresses his workers shows his character. "The Lord be with you." Even though she didn't realize it, Ruth was being watched by the supervisor. He reported to Boaz how she had asked if she could glean, even though she was in her right to do so without asking. He also reported her hard work. So here Boaz asked the foreman of the harvesters, "Whose young woman is that?" The foreman replied, "She is a Moabitess who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves behind the harvesters.' She went in the field and has worked steadily from morning till now, except for a short rest in the shelter." So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the fields where the men are harvesting, and follow along after the girls. I have told the men not to touch you, and whenever you're thirsty, go and get a drink from water from the jars the men have filled." At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She exclaimed, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes, that you notice me, a foreigner?" So when Boaz spoke to Ruth, he provided her with three things. He provided first with companionship, working among the female workers. Secondly, protection from the young men. And third, refreshment when she was thirsty. Boaz was showing true kindness to Ruth, even though it showed no return for him. So Ruth is thankful for Boaz's kindness. She knows full well that she is a stranger to them, and Boaz's kindness overwhelms her. In the dynamic of a small town of Bethlehem, the word of the story of the Moabitess Ruth had returning with Naomi, and what she had done to help her mother-in-law had traveled fast. So Boaz replies, "I've been told all about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with a people that you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have taken refuge. May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have given me comfort and have spoken kindly to your servant, though I do not have the standing of one of your servant girls." So Boaz also knew of Ruth's dedication to their God and leaving her family and gods behind. So at mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When he sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all she wanted and had some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave orders to his men. "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull some of the stalks for her from the bundles and leave them for her to pick up, and do not rebuke her." So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. Then she threshed the barley she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephod. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, "Where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you." Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the place that she had been working. "The name of the man I worked with today was Boaz," she said. "The Lord bless him," Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. "He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead." So when asked to join them to eat, Ruth doesn't forget Naomi and keeps something back for her. In the afternoon, he has the reapers drop some of the crops for Ruth to pick up, thereby blessing her further without making a charity case out of her. Naomi added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our kinsman redeemers." Then Ruth the Moabitess said, he even said to me, "Stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain." Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, "It will be good for you, my daughter, to go with the girls, because in someone else's field you might be harmed." So Ruth stayed close to the servant girls of Boaz to clean until the barley and wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So Ruth finishes the day collecting over 5 gallons of barley. When Ruth returned home with the barley and the leftovers from lunch for Naomi, Naomi praised God for his goodness. Even though Naomi returned to Bethlehem empty and afflicted as Mara, she is now seeing the mercy of God. One day, Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, should I not try to find a home for you where you'll be provided for? Is not Boaz, with whose servant girls you have been a kinsman of ours? Tonight he will be winnowing barley on the threshing floor. Wash and perfume yourself and put on your best clothes." By now the harvest time was coming to an end. When Ruth and Naomi returned to Bethlehem, it was the beginning of the barley harvest, not the Harley harvest. So we know it was mid-April around Passover. In the Hebrew calendar, Passover is on the 15th of the month of Nisan, and the wheat harvest follows 7 weeks later at the time of Pentecost, or 50 days after Passover. Ruth had worked every day gleaning in the fields of Boaz, so they had roughly 2 months to spend with each other in a public setting. Now we see Naomi beginning to push Ruth to pursue Boaz as a possible husband. There's so many reasons she would have done this. Ruth has been alone for some time since her husband, Naomi's son, had passed away. Both Naomi and Ruth were widows and living alone. It was very difficult for widows without sons to survive in that time. Also, I'm sure that Naomi wanted Ruth to be in a good relationship. But there was much more to it than just that. Naomi and her husband, Elimelech, apparently had sold family land before they left Moab 10 years earlier. This was land that God had given to the families of the Israelites. In Hebrew tradition, family land could not be sold, but more of just a long-term lease. So every 50 years, there's a celebration called Jubilee. At that time, all land would always return to the original owners, original landowners. But if at other times, if land had been sold by a family member, then a close relative could purchase it back for them. But there were pre-existing conditions that had to be met. The document or the title deed to the land was a scroll, scroll form. On the outside of the scroll would be the conditions that had to be met in order for a goel, a redeemer, to buy the land back. So what would happen is that to buy it back, they would have to break each seal by completing the condition of the sale in order to open the scroll and regain the title scroll to the land. That's pretty interesting. Only a goel or kinsman redeemer could purchase the property and redeem it to the original owner or family. Naomi probably wanted her land back. Next is an interesting law about a widow without a son. In Deuteronomy, we read about a Levirate marriage, and that's when a brother of a deceased man is obligated to marry his brother's widow and have a son who would carry on the deceased man's name. In Deuteronomy 25, 5 through 9, it's if brothers are living together and one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. However, if the man does not want to marry his brother's wife, she shall go to the elders at the town gate and say, my husband's brother refuses to carry out his brother's name in Israel. He will not fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to me. Then the elders of the town shall summon him and talk to him. If he persists in saying, I do not want to marry her, his brother's widow shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, take off one of her sandals and spit in his face and say, this is what is done to me. This is what is done to the man who will not build up his brother's family line. Apparently that tradition doesn't carry on today. So Naomi wants her deceased husband and son's name to continue. A Goel, or kinsman redeemer, can do both. He can both purchase back the land, and he can continue, by marrying the widow, can continue the family name through a son. So Naomi instructs Ruth on how to pursue Boaz. So what we see in this is that Naomi is, as a Jewish woman, is teaching Ruth, as a Gentile, all of the details about the Hebrew laws. So Naomi instructs her on how best to pursue Boaz. With the harvest season ending, the barley and wheat needed to be processed. Boaz would be at the threshing floor winnowing the barley and wheat. This is Naomi continuing. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know you are there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. I will do whatever you say, Ruth answered. She went down to the threshing floor and did everything her mother-in-law told her to do. So Ruth gets ready for her visit to Boaz. For the past 2 months, she has been always going to work in the fields, but now she cleans up and puts on her best clothes as Naomi instructs. Boaz is staying with his harvest, perhaps to protect his investment. In 1 Samuel 23:1, there's a description of threshing floors being robbed. So after he eats and drinks, he lays down to sleep. When Boaz had finished eating and drinking, and was in good spirits, he went over to lie down at the far end of the grain pile. Ruth approached quietly, uncovered his feet, and lays down. In the middle of the night, something startled the man, and he turned and discovered the woman lying at his feet. For me, it's usually a border collie. Okay, so Naomi quietly uncovers his feet and lays down at his feet. So this should not be confused with laying down at his side, which might have indicated a physical relationship, as many try to apply to the passage. Ruth laid down at his feet to show great humility and submission, and shows herself as Boaz's servant. In like form, we should show ourselves to Jesus in submission as his bondservants. Who are you, he asked. I am Ruth, your servant, she said. Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a kinsman redeemer. When Boaz woke at midnight and found her at his feet, it starts an interesting but highly prophetic discussion takes place. Ruth starts the discussion with, take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative. Here are many implications. First, Ruth was asking him to marry her with under your wing. She was also putting forth his obligation from Hebrew law as a family goel. But she was also repeating what Boaz had said to her when they first met in chapter 2, verse 12. May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge. So this could have been interpreted as spread the corner of your garment over me. Remember that at the corners of a man's garments were tzitzits. If you've seen pictures of like Jewish men at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, and you'll see like under their shirt or sweater, they have strings hanging down that look like this, but one of the strings will be blue. This was called a tzitzit, and it comes from Numbers 15:38. They were strings tied in special knots and worn as ritual fringes that represented a man standing. It also reminded him of his obligation to God. So in this, there was a way that they were tied. It's 4 strings looped over to create 8 cords, It had 2 overhand knots, 7 wraps, 2 overhand knots, 11 wraps, 2 overhand knots, 13 wraps, 2 overhand knots, 15 wraps, and 2 overhand knots. If I got that right. Or was it 12? Yeah. Anyway, what this was to do is to remind them of the 613 laws. And they would wear them on the corner of their garments. So we've seen several places in the Bible where the corner of the garment or the hem of the garment was mentioned. Like the woman who had bled for 12 years and she touched the hem of the garment. Perhaps she was reaching out to touch this. When Ruth covered herself with the corner of the garment, it would have shown or reminded Boaz of his obligations to the laws of Leviticus, the 613 laws. If I don't drop it. Okay. So the prophetic statement is from Ezekiel, or this prophetic statement is from Ezekiel 16:8, where God uses the same terminology in relation to Israel. And Ezekiel 16:8, later I passed by, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your nakedness. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine. So Ruth identified Boaz as the family Goel, with you are a close relative. Ruth was being bold but not inappropriate. She did this with humility, yet properly sought her rights. This is Boaz speaking. The Lord bless you, my daughter, he replied. The kindness is greater than that which you showed earlier. You have not run after younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid, for I will do what all you ask. All my fellow townsmen know that you are a woman of noble character. Although it is true I am near of kin, there is a kinsman redeemer nearer than I. So Boaz, in his response, he praises Ruth and agrees to redeem her. Yet this is one obstacle that must be addressed. Some things to consider about Boaz. He was an older man and not married. Ruth was a younger woman, and Boaz could have forced himself on her from the beginning as a family redeemer. Yet he always treated her with respect and honor. He was kind enough to let her decide. It also says a lot about Ruth. Ruth was willing to overlook the younger men for a man with a godly character. Stay here for the night, and in the morning, if he wants to redeem, good, let him redeem. But if he is not willing, as surely as the Lord lives, I will do it. Lie here until morning. So she lay at the feet until morning and got up before anyone could be recognized. And he said, don't let it be known that a woman came to the threshing floor. He also said, bring me the shawl you are wearing and hold it out. When she did, he poured into it 6 measures of barley and put it on her. Then she went back to town. And she went into the city in King James. The second kinsman redeemer obstacle. As we get into the next section, Boaz is a representation of Jesus. As sinners, we need to be redeemed by God. As we look further into this in the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at the names of these people and who they represent. In this, Ruth will represent the Gentile nation. Naomi represents the Jewish nation. Boaz will be a representation of Jesus. And as we get further in this, it's going to be just profound how this works out. So in the kinsman redeemer, the second kinsman redeemer, Merriam-Webster defines redeemed as to buy back, to get or win back, or to free from what distresses or harms, to free from captivity by payment of a ransom, to extricate from or help to overcome something detrimental, to release from blame or debt, to free from the consequences of sin. So do we have a redeemer? When we look at the book of Ruth prophetically, we see the story of God's love to those who come to him. When we look at the book of Ruth as typology, we see Boaz as Jesus, Naomi as a Jewish nation, Ruth is a church of Gentiles and Jews who accept Jesus as a Messiah. But who is this unnamed second kinsman redeemer? If we think about being redeemed back to our Creator, there is only one answer who the unnamed redeemer could be, and that's the law. There are only two ways a human can be redeemed back to the Creator. The first is by keeping the 613 laws and 10 commandments of the Old Testament. The second is by accepting the payment of ransom that Jesus did for us on the cross in Calvary. Only one human has ever been redeemed by the 613 laws and 10 commandments. That was Jesus. But yet in this story, the law is the first kinsman redeemer. So Boaz tells Ruth of this other redeemer that he has first dibs on her and says he will go to him and speak to him. Boaz could not exercise his right as kinsman redeemer unless the closer kinsman redeemer relinquishes his rights towards Ruth. In Leviticus 25:25, if one of your fellow Israelites becomes poor and sells some of their property, the nearest relative is to come and redeem what they have sold. So when Ruth came to her mother-in-law and asked her, "How did it go, my daughter?" Then she told her everything Boaz had done for her and added, "He gave me the 6 measures of barley and said, 'Don't go back to your mother-in-law empty-handed.'" Then Naomi said, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until this matter is settled." So although Boaz loved Ruth and wanted to marry her, he wanted to make sure it was God's will, and he would do it in accordance with the law. Boaz does not want anyone to think bad of Ruth or anything to happen to her walking home in the dark, so he has her stay till just before daylight. He also does not want her to go home empty. He gives her 6 measures in the Hebrew text of barley, 6 ephahs, would have been a little over 30 gallons, far more than she could have carried. But we do know it's probably as much as she could possibly carry. The use of 6 has many different possibilities of which it could represent, but most likely it's for the 6 pious men who would descend from her with 6 spiritual gifts. And that's David, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and the Messiah. Did I read that? Yes. Okay. Sorry, I had a senior moment there. Okay. So meanwhile, Boaz goes to the town gate and sat there. When the kinsman redeemer he had mentioned came along, Boaz said, "Come over here, my friend, and sit down." So he went over and sat down. Notice he goes to the town gate. In that time, the city gates and the town gates were where the elders would gather to talk about different legal matters. It was kind of like the local courthouse. So he's gone to the local courthouse, to the city gate, to take care of this matter. So it's a place where elders would meet to discuss business or judicial matters. It's a combination of city council chamber and a courtroom. Boaz took 10 of the elders of the town and said, "Sit here," and they did so. Then he said to the kinsman redeemer, "Naomi, who has come back from Moab, is selling the piece of land that belongs to our brother Elimelech. I thought I should bring the matter to your attention and suggest that you buy it in the presence of these seated here and in the presence of the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, do so. But if you will not, tell me, so I will know. For no one has the right to do it except you, and I am the next in line." The first kinsman redeemer said, "I will redeem it," he said. So Boaz calls the nearest kinsman by name, obviously knowing him. Yet the scripture doesn't give his name. Perhaps the writer of Ruth doesn't want him remembered for his refusal to take responsibility to preserve his brother's name. When Joshua led the Israelites into the promised land, it was divided up between the tribes and never meant a sold. In Leviticus 25, 8 through 27, we see that every 50 years, or Jubilee year, the land had to return to original family group. Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the land from Naomi and from Ruth the Moabitess, you acquire the dead man's widow, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property. At this, the kinsman redeemer said, "Then I cannot redeem it, because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot do it." Now, in earlier times in Israel, for the redemption and transfer of property to become final, one party took off his sandal and gave it to the others. This was the method of legalizing transactions in Israel. So the kinsman redeemer said to Boaz, "Buy it yourself," and he removed his sandal. There must have been a lot of men and women just with one sandal. So here, when Boaz brought up the matter of the land, the nearest kinsman quickly agreed to take the land. But taking the land had attachments that came along with it, namely Naomi and Ruth. When he learned that there was excess baggage attached, he changed his mind. Because of Naomi's name, the nearest kinsman was not expected to marry Naomi and have a son to carry out Elimelech's name, but would have to take Ruth as a wife and continue the family name through her. When he considered this, the nearest kinsman declined to redeem the property. Perhaps he had grown children, and the problem with inheritance between his grown children and new children made it too complicated. Or if he was married, bringing home another wife might cause grief on the home front. You never know. But from a prophetic view, the law could take Ruth, a Moabitess, as a wife, but the offspring to the 10th generation would have a curse on them. That's from Deuteronomy 23:3. So it was the custom in Israel to conform a transaction that one man would take off his sandal and give it to the other. This dates back to Deuteronomy 25, as shown previously. Apparently, the tradition of being spat on the face by the woman involved has been lost over time. Okay, so Boaz announced to the elders and all the people, "Today you are witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all of the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabitess, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among the family or from the town records. Today you are my witnesses." So Boaz then makes a public announcement to the elders and the people gathered of his redeeming the land and taking Ruth as his wife. Then the elders and all those who are at the gate said, "We are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you have standing in Ephrath and be famous in Bethlehem. Though through the offspring the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. Then he went to her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. So next, the witnesses give their blessing to Boaz and Ruth. Boaz was compared to Rachel and Leah, who bore the 13 children to Abraham, as well as the house of Perez, the son of Judah, and Tamar, who was the ancestor of the Bethlehemites. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you with a kinsman redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you is better than 7 sons and gives him birth." Then Naomi took the child and laid him in her lap and cared for him. The woman living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Did you notice here that Naomi now has the son and the women name him? We'll talk about that next week. Okay, so when Ruth bore her son Obed, Elimelech's name would continue. And Naomi, who chose to return to God, was now blessed with a grandson whom she would raise. This, then, is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. So in this story, in this love story, at the end we get this lineage. Notice from Perez there's 10 before you get to David. We'll talk about that next week too. Okay, so this shows lineage before Obed and goes through going down to Jesse and then to King David. If we look at the list of names, we know that Judah had had an adulterous late relationship with Tamar, and that got the ball rolling. Then their descendant was Perez. So from the relationship between Judah and Tamar, it's been 10 generations before David. So let me finish with this. In Isaiah 54, in verses 4 through 8, it kind of applies to this. It says, "Do not be afraid. You will not be put to shame. Do not fear disgrace. You will not be humiliated. You will forget the shame of your youth and remember no more the reproach of your widowhood. For your Maker is your husband. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all the earth. The Lord will call you back as if you were a wife deserted and distressed in spirit, a wife who married young, only to be rejected, says your God. For a brief moment I abandoned you, but with deep compassion I will bring you back. In a surge of anger I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness I have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer." So that is kind of just an overview of the 4 chapters of Ruth. So what we'll go into next week and the week after is we'll look at these even deeper. Did any of you catch some of the interesting things in that? This is a real prophetic view of the relationship between the Jewish nation and the Gentile nation. Naomi taught Ruth about the Redeemer, and she teaches her the traditions. In the same way, the Old Testament taught how to recognize the coming Messiah, in this case, Boaz. Naomi did not go out and look for him or recognize him, but Ruth did. Ruth recognizes the Redeemer, the Goel, and introduces him back to Naomi. In the same way that in the last 7 years, he will be revealed back to the Jewish nation. So for next time, we'll start getting into this deeper, but we see it's just this incredible picture of the relationship between the Jewish nation and the Gentile nation. We could not have existed without them. They cannot find the Messiah without us. So it's this beautiful picture of how the two work together. And we'll also see a lot of symbolism in the son that was born. Some things to notice is that the women are the one who named the son. That has significance on what had happened to Boaz. Naomi is going to raise the child. That has significance as to what happened to Ruth. And we'll also look at things like how many days the child was, or how many weeks the child was in Ruth, how many days it is before they're named, and how this all prophetically is a picture of the end times. So with that, I'll close for the evening. I got you out of here before midnight. Yeah. Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to look at your word. And God, I just ask that it was a blessing for people to hear this, and that it just kind of gives such a beautiful picture into your plan for salvation and your plan for everything throughout history. And God, I just ask you to go with everyone tonight and just watch over them as they travel and give everyone a safe and blessed week. And this, I pray in the name of your Savior, Yeshua HaMashiach, Jesus of Nazareth. Amen.